Hi everybody, welcome back to Contemporary American Literature. We are continuing our exploration this week of realist fiction, particularly of the 1950s, 1960s, before we enter a later phase of non-realist fiction of various sorts that we'll be encountering later in the course. And our next author and our next story is the notorious Defender of the Faith by the notorious Philip Roth. So Philip Roth is an interesting author to consider because he has had a kind of a strange career in American literature. I normally only give you one picture of a writer, but this time I gave you two because I wanted to suggest the interesting thing about Philip Roth is that he is in many ways among the most controversial American writers of the 20th century who came under intense criticism for a wide variety of reasons. And not only that, but we talked about the kind of what writers, other writers this week, like James Baldwin and Flannery O'Connor, what they thought fiction was for. And Roth, I think, thought in certain ways that the goal of fiction was to disrupt a consensus, to unsettle the reader, to be provocative, to be a provocation, to be something that offended you, to be something that upset you, so that you didn't become complacent and just sort of fall into patterns and routines and habits. And so he was a very controversial writer, and I think in the first picture I put there, which is I think one of the best pictures of Philip Roth, of him sort of pointing at the reader in a I don't know what he's doing, a provocative gesture, that suggests that aspect of his work, this very provocative, very controversial writer. And this is one of his first pieces of writing. We're seeing him at the very beginning of his career with this short story, Defender of the Faith, and it caused controversy right away. It caused a lot of trouble right out of the gate. So we want to look at that. But then my other picture of him receiving the Presidential Medal of the Arts or something from Barack Obama, who is a big fan of Roth's, suggests the other part of Roth's career and his project, which is that by the end of his life, he was also one of the most celebrated and one of the most beloved American writers of his time and his generation, a perennial candidate for the Nobel Prize for Literature, and beloved of the establishment, the critical and indeed in certain ways political establishment by the end of his life. So he was controversial, he was provocative, but also he inspired a certain affection and a certain loyalty and a certain love. So those are the two sides of his life and his career, and I think we can see that in this story, as I'm going to show you. I think there's a part of this story that's just an in-your-face provocation, just daring you to be offended at a certain aspect of what he's suggesting and what he's doing. And yet, if you read the story carefully, you'll see that it is grounded in genuine human emotion, in a certain genuine sentiment that is there, and that is there's a lot of now I'm going to speak sentimentally. I've read a lot of books by Philip Roth. There's a lot of love in Roth, despite the fact that there's also this other side, this calculated, provocateur, contrarian, we might now say edgelord kind of side to Roth, but there's also genuine affection, genuine sentiment, genuine love. And I think we can see that even in this initial story. So who is Philip Roth? He lived from 1933 to 2018. He was born in Newark, New Jersey, to first-generation Jewish American parents, and a lot of his work is recollecting his childhood in Newark, and he really put Newark on the map as a literary location in American life. And he studied at Bucknell and the University of Chicago, and he taught creative writing and literature until 1991. He also did serve 2 years in the U.S. Army, and he was married twice, both times disastrously. I'll let you read about that on your own. But he I point out again, he taught creative writing. I don't think his degree was in creative writing. I think he had a master's just in literature, as in like literary criticism. But he taught creative writing, which goes back to what I was saying about Flannery O'Connor, about the professionalization of creative writing as an academic discipline being important in American literature. And as I already noted, He was known for the controversies caused by his novels. He started out writing short stories, but then after a certain point, he only wrote novels. And due to their sexual frankness, so he wrote a famously dirty book in 1969 called Portnoy's Complaint, which was about a young Jewish American boy's coming of age, including his coming of sexual age, and this was an extremely controversial book. He was also criticized by feminists because he tended to write, and particularly about sex, from a heterosexual male perspective that was sometimes, again, deliberately outrageous, and so the portrayals of women and sexuality in his works were often seen as offensive both by conservative Jewish and Christian groups and also by feminist groups who thought that they were exploitative or objectifying of women. Though he had some feminist defenders as well who said that he was critically exploring male desire rather than just endorsing it. So that's a complicated subject. Yet, as I said, also one of the most honored and celebrated American writers of his time. And why was he honored and celebrated, despite all the other stuff I just noted? Why was he not just, as we would now say, just canceled? Because, for one thing, there was, particularly in his later work, a turn to writing about American history and portraying the 20th century. And so his later work, which turned away from being so concerned with this idea of male sexuality and was more political and was seen as a really incisive and insightful series of political novels that he wrote in the 90s, the American trilogy from 1997 to 2000. For one thing, that sort of broadened his work beyond this, and those works weren't so deliberately outrageous in the same way some of his early works were. And also, he was of probably the second generation, but early in the first, around the first mid-century wave of important Jewish American writers. We talked about the diversification of literature that's already starting to happen in the mid-20th century, where you have writers from outside that white, Protestant, straight male group becoming more and more prominent on the scene, whether it's African American writers or Catholic writers, or in Roth's case, Jewish American writers. So he was of a slightly younger generation. The first wave were people like the playwright Arthur Miller and the novelist Saul Bellow, who are also in our anthology. But Roth was of the next kind of important generation of Jewish American writers. So he's seen as also being very important to the Jewish American literary tradition, somebody who is one of its early and key players. And I just put my little characteristic excerpt from the bio on the slide there, where I talk about the way that he was seen by critics, that he was immensely talented, but people were concerned that was this talent wasted in his provocations, in his sometimes caricatural approach to characters. And was he not sort of neglecting what they called deeper sympathies and more humanly generous purposes, which I can already hear him making fun of that as too sentimental. But I do want to show you that there are deeper sympathies and humanly generous purposes in this story that caused such controversy. Because Roth's first book is called Goodbye Columbus. It's a novella with 5 stories, and one of the stories is Defender of the Faith, which had also, I think, appeared in a magazine just before the book publication. And this was a great first book. Everybody said, wow, what a talented, what a promising writer. And yet there was a lot of controversy, particularly within the Jewish American community, particularly about this story. And why was there controversy about this story? Well, you read it, because the thing that the story posits as a possibility, and it was controversial then and it's controversial now, it posits as a possibility that you have this character, and this character Grossbart. So the story is narrated, it's first-person narrative by a man named Nathan Marks, who's in the U.S. Army and is during World War II. This is not autobiographical, by the way. Roth was too young to fight in World War II. So Roth is imagining himself into another character, who is Nathan Marks, who's the narrator. And Marx has been in Europe and has fought in Germany in World War II. And now the war in Europe has ended, and so they're on a military base. And he meets this younger Jewish American kid named Grossbart, who's only 19 years old. And Grossbart is somebody who keeps looking to Marx as a, I think a superior in the military to help him fight what he sees as anti-Semitic prejudices in the army. And Marx is sort of sympathetic, but then he's gradually noticing that Grossbart is doing this in a self-serving way. That Grossbart is claiming to be very religious and very concerned about his identity, but these complaints are really self-serving. So there's two things there that are going to cause controversy. First is the general proposition that somebody making claims to victimhood on the basis of identity could be doing it for opportunistic reasons. I think that back in the 60s or late 50s, particularly among the liberal literary community, same as today, people are very resistant to that idea. We want to say, look, there are these power disparities, there's these structural imbalances. So if somebody says that they are harmed by one of these power imbalances, these ambient prejudices, then we should believe that person. We shouldn't distrust that person. We shouldn't dismiss that person. And Roth is saying, and he prided himself on this sort of grounded realism in the actual behavior of human beings, not an idealism about what we wish people were. And he said, if you look at this from a realistic perspective, you're going to have people take advantage of this idea. You're going to have people who are opportunists. You're going to have people who are just out for themselves and are manipulating any situation they can find. And so if they find there's a situation where victimhood can be power, then they will avail themselves of that just as they would avail themselves of anything else. And that's a dangerous idea. That's an idea that people were resistant to then, people are going to be resistant to now. It's an idea we don't want to think is true. But Roth is saying, if you think about the way people actually are, you'll see that there's often a selfishness. There's often a self-servingness. And Roth's, one of the reasons he wrote so much about sex, this story, of course, has nothing to do with sex, but he's famous for writing about sex in an offensive way, is because he often wrote about sex in this way too. That people are motivated by base desires, and you can't get away from that. You can't wish that away. You can't moralize that away. People are motivated by these things they don't want to talk about, and they want to hide under some moral rhetoric, but it's really selfishness that often motivates us as people. So that's the first level on which this story is going to cause offense to somebody. And then the second level is, so that's a more general proposition, that the claim of harm can be opportunistic. So that's offensive enough at the general level. But then at the more particular level of the Jewish American experience, Jewish readers of this story said, well, isn't Roth here validating a certain stereotype, an anti-Semitic stereotype, particularly applied by the prejudiced to Jewish people, that Jewish people are sort of selfish or manipulate their in-group status, which is something that there's a character in the story who's the Marxist superior officer. Sorry, I've forgotten both his name and rank. I can't always remember minor characters. But the point of this character, he's a white, non-Jewish man, and he's trying throughout the story, he thinks he's very broad-minded and progressive about race and ethnicity and religion, but everything that comes out of his mouth is totally offensive. And he sort of delivers some of these stereotypes almost without knowing what he's saying. And Roth's Jewish critics were saying he is validating these stereotypes by portraying a Jewish character in Grossbart who fits into these stereotypes. How can he do that? And Roth's reply in some of his later work, where he always replied to his critics, implicitly in his later work, they would criticize his work, and then he'd write another book that sort of was a obvious reply to the critics of the earlier book. And his reply there was, if you're a member of a minority, marginalized, oppressed group who has stereotypes applied to it, understandably, you're going to be resistant to validating those stereotypes. And yet the problem is, in all of humanity, in every group of people, ethnic, religious, racial, of humanity, there's the full human capacity for good behavior and bad behavior. And so you can't ask a writer who's a realist, who's trying to write about real life, not to write about people in their own groups who behave in ways that are, say, selfish or self-serving or opportunistic. Because Roth's point is everybody does. Roth's point is everybody from time to time behaves that way. There's people who behave that way in every group. So I don't ask you to accept either of those two propositions. I expect Roth, even now, 3 years after his death, to go on being a controversial writer that inspires a lot of outrage. And I imagine those two propositions will, even today, seem fully, or maybe more today than maybe like 20 years ago, to seem outrageous. But I'm trying to articulate what he was thinking when he was making these calculated provocations of the reader. And one of Roth's biographers, Claudia Roth Pierpont, no relation, as she always points out, she wrote a kind of biography called Roth Unbound back when he was still alive, and she sort of narrates this almost trial upon which Roth was put in a Jewish American university setting, where he was invited on a panel to speak of the crisis of conscience in minority writers of fiction. And he appeared with an African American author and an Italian American author, but really they were interested in interrogating him over his portrayal of Jewish people. And he and it's an interesting, I'm not going to read the whole excerpt because I'm trying to be brief on this one, but the opening question was, Mr. Roth, would you write the same stories you've written if you were living in Nazi Germany? And he was, shocked by this. And Ralph Ellison, who was the African-American writer, the famous writer of Invisible Man, who appeared with him, tried to defend him, because actually Ellison had faced some of the same criticism from within the African-American community. This is going to be a theme we're going to see throughout this semester, by the way, of authors who are writing from trying to write their own vision, but also they feel a kind of responsibility to the marginalized or oppressed group to which they belong. And how do you negotiate the ethics? How much are you writing for yourself, from yourself? How much are you telling what you see as the truth? And how much do you need to do ethically on behalf of the threatened group to which you belong? This is going to recur as a theme throughout the semester, so we're hearing it for the first time here. And Roth was very struck by this, and he said, I'll never write about Jews again, in 1962, which of course, and he did, he wrote like 2 books that were set in non-Jewish American sort of enclaves, but then he returned to writing about Jewish Americans with his very controversial Portnoy's Complaint of 1969. I just want to end by looking at a couple of passages, though, that point out that there is a nuance and a subtlety in this story that makes it more than a cartoonish or caricatural negative view of humanity as simply motivated by selfishness. One of them is that one of the reasons Marx always wants to help Grossbart is because there's a genuine shared identity and affinity and culture between them. There's a couple scenes where Grossbart talks to Marx, and it made Marx remember. It suddenly touched some deep memory, and I was remembering the shrill sounds of a Bronx playground where years ago, beside the grand concourse, I had played on long spring evenings such as this, those thin, fading sounds. It was a pleasant memory for a young man so far from peace and home, and it brought so very many recollections with it that I began to grow exceedingly tender about myself. And so on the one hand, you can hear a little Rothian cynicism in tender about myself. This feeling it inspires in him is itself a little bit self-serving, or even, dare I say, self-pleasuring. But nevertheless, there's a genuine, there's a genuine affinity and a genuine identity they share. It's a real thing to meet somebody who comes from the same world you did, and to have that connection. That's not false, and Roth is not disparaging that, and he doesn't in his work disparage that. And there's an enormous affection and love for his childhood in the Jewish American community in Newark throughout his work. And I want to point out that affection is there. It's not just a cynical story. And similarly, see, but Grossbart always takes something like that and twists it into something wrong. And Grossbart says, away from home it gives one such a sense of his Jewishness, which is what we just were seeing above, the genuineness of collective identity. But then Grossbart says, and remember, this story is set in 1945, so right after the Holocaust. And Grossbart says, that's what happened in Germany. They didn't stick together. They let themselves get pushed around. Now, the problem with that is that first of all, it's what they call blaming the victim. Okay, so it wasn't that the Jewish citizens of Germany let themselves be pushed around. They were aggressed upon by a powerful, modern, totalitarian state. So in that sense, what he's saying is just wrong. But it also shows, I think, Roth's sense of the way this idea of collective identity can be twisted around into something kind of bullying and ugly, and it's not enough to fall back on collective identity even though it's real. You ultimately have to be what I call in the next slide, you have to have individual responsibility for your own moral choices, because if you don't, then you're going to end up saying things that, like Grossbart says, that Grossbart is blaming the victims of the Holocaust for not having stuck together. He's blaming the victim, and that's a way in which collective identity becomes a very ugly idea. And so you need to fall back on individual moral choice. You can't just rely on your collective identity. And throughout the story, there's this sense that Marx is going to become Grossbart somehow. He feels pulled to him. There's some appeal that Grossbart has to him. And at the end of the story, when he calls up the chain of command, because Grossbart, in the final sort of terrible thing Grossbart does, is he has himself spared from being sent to the Pacific, because the war in the Pacific in 1945 is still going on. And he has himself spared and not his two friends, who he had claimed that so much of what he was doing was out of loyalty for his two other Jewish friends. And this just shows that he's completely out for himself. And so Marx, rather brutally, calls up to have that position reversed and have Grossbart shipped to the Pacific, which could very well mean to his death. Now, of course, the reader reading in the late 50s knows that the war in the Pacific was almost over, and so it probably wouldn't have been to Grossbart's death. So there's a kind of not totally unhappy ending that we know about, that the characters don't know about. That's called dramatic irony, when you know more than the characters. But Marx is more or less sending Grossbart to his death, and he claims that he does it. He says, I did it for all of us, he tells Grossbart. And it's not clear what all of us means. Is it the U.S. Army, the United States, the Jewish community? But I think the idea is that for all of us to get along, we have to kind of punish a little bit the cheaters in our midst. That's the only way all of us can function as a collective. If people who are manipulating our sentiment and our desire to do well, we need to punish those cheaters. But it's not an easy choice, and the story ends with that line where Grossbart is accepting his fate and then resisting with all my will and impulse to turn and seek pardon for my vindictiveness. I accepted my own. And that is Marx's, and this is again that existential mood I was talking about. Marx accepts his responsibility for the values he's created in not letting Grossbart get away with it, but also note that impulse to turn and seek pardon. He still feels a connection. He feels an affinity for Grossbart. There's a certain there is, as I was saying, a kind of love in this story. There's a tenderness in this story that you don't want to miss. You can't dismiss it as just a kind of, well, you can do whatever you want. You're free people, but but my position is you can't dismiss this or other works of Roth as simply cruel cartoons, though sometimes he goes too far in that direction. But I think in this story already you see that mix of the two pictures I put, the provocateur sort of poking his finger at you, but also the person who seeks and earns the respect of his community, of all of us, however you want to define that. So thanks very much and have a great day.